So without further me chatting, I'd like to get quickly to our guests. Tonight we're joined by Ralph Buehler and John Pucher, who will talk about their new book, Cycling for Sustainable Cities. Ralph is Professor and Chair of Urban Affairs and Planning in the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech's Research Center in Arlington. So even though he's a Hokie, he's a DMV Hokie. And John Pucher is a Professor Emeritus in the Urban Planning and Policy Development Program at Rutgers University's Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. And that's all I'm going to say for a little while. I'd like to turn it over to our guests. And remember to ask your questions. They're going to hang out for a while at the end.
So I'm John Pucher, and both Ralph and I would like to thank Peter Krebs of the Piedmont Environmental Council for all the time and effort he's devoted to organizing this webinar talk as part of their series of talks kicking off Bike Month right now in May. We also thank Peter's colleagues at the Piedmont Environmental Council and their partners at the Virginia Coalition for Smarter Growth and the University of Virginia's Office of Sustainability. Finally, Ralph and I thank each and every one of you for taking the time to participate in this webinar on cycling for sustainable cities. Now, just a few words about me, John Pucher. Almost all of my research over the past 4 decades, which tells you how old I am, and that's not young, has involved international comparisons of urban transportation systems, policies, and travel behavior. That helps explain the very international scope of this new book. I've always felt that we can learn a lot from other countries about how to improve urban transportation here in North America, especially when it comes to public transit, walking, and of course, cycling, the topic of this book. It was my 3 years on sabbatical as visiting professor at the University of Münster, Germany, where, by the way, 40% of all trips are by bike, and that's a city of 250,000 people, so it's quite a big city in a sense, not a little town. And those 3 years in Münster, Germany, inspired my love of cycling and motivated my cycling research of the past 25 years. Finally, I have to confess to y'all Virginians that I am a Tar Heel. I grew up in Carolina and I attended UNC Chapel Hill, which, by the way, in fact, had the very first actual student of any state university in the United States, even though UVA had a state university charter that was slightly earlier, which I think is cheating, to tell you the truth. And I can already hear the boos all the way from Raleigh, from the UVA crowd. So I'll pass it along now to my colleague, Ralph Buehler, who is a Virginia Tech Hokie, whatever in the world a Hokie is. Ralph.
Thank you, John. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Ralph Buehler. I'm professor and chair of urban affairs and planning at Virginia Tech on the Arlington campus. My work looks at determinants of travel behavior. So I'm interested in what makes people walk, ride a bike, ride public transport, or drive, and then looking at the implications of these choices for the environment, the economy, and for equity. Most of my work has an international comparative perspective, looking what different countries or cities can learn from each other. And that brings us to the book, because the book was a big international collaboration with over 40 experts on bicycling from 5 continents in the areas of planning, engineering, geography, and public health. And we're very fortunate to be able to bring this network together in this book. Here you can see a cover of the book, and you already see on the cover what it is about in bicycling. It's people dressed in everyday clothes, riding leisurely on normal bikes. There's a green bike traffic signal there giving the bicycles a go, and This is not a special event, by the way. This is a daily scene from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. We'll see more of this later.
Ralph, please, back. Please, everyone, note that there are lots of women here cycling. In the Netherlands, 55% of all cyclists are women, and that's the way it should be. Okay.
The book is roughly divided into 3 sections. In the first section, John and I are setting the stage with international comparisons of cycling in cities and countries around the world. And then the book focuses on specific topics of cycling. The first is cycling and public health. The next focuses on the important topic of safety of bicycling and for bicyclists. Then we have a chapter on bicycling infrastructure to assure cycling by everyone and safe cycling. Next, we focus on bike parking because bicycles are parked more than they are ridden, so the parking is clearly important. After that, we have a chapter that looks at other measures other than infrastructure that help promote bicycling. Bert van Wies' chapter then evaluates cycling policies and projects. It looks at how can we make decisions about which project to build and which project to prioritize, which project not to build. The next 2 chapters look at technology and bicycling. The first one is on e-bikes and their rapid spread and increase in Europe and North America. And the second one looks at the even more rapid spread of bike sharing and the evolution of the technology. The next chapters then focus on different groups of cyclists. The first is on women and cycling, the next one on children and cycling, and the third one in this group is focuses on older adults and bicycling. This is then capped off by a chapter that focuses on social justice, equity, and bicycling. So this is about equity among cyclists, but also equitable implementation of bicycling-friendly policies in our cities. The next section of the book then consists of country and city case studies. The first one is on the 2 largest countries in the world, China and India, and trends in bicycling there, followed by a chapter focusing on cycling in Latin America. The next chapter looks at cycling in mega cities, comparing New York City, London, and Paris, which is then followed by a comparison of the 2 large European bike-friendly cities of Copenhagen and Amsterdam. And then chapter 19 is a comparison of 2 cities that haven't had a history of bicycling, Portland, Oregon, and Seville, Spain, and how they were able to implement pro-bike policies there and increase cycling. The next chapter looks at bicycling advocacy in Europe, North America, and Australia at different levels of government. And then finally, John and I bring it all together into some lessons for promoting bicycling for sustainable transportation.
Given the title of the book, it won't surprise any of you listening in or watching that our opinion is that cycling is an extraordinarily sustainable means of travel around cities. And when we say sustainable, we're really using 3 different dimensions of sustainability. The obvious one is environmental sustainability, and I think everyone will understand that bicycling is environmentally friendly. There's just no pollution, very little in the way of non-renewable resources that are being used. Economical, the third point here, is sort of obvious too. It doesn't cost all that much to buy a bike. Unless you want to splurge on a $5,000 bike, you can get a pretty good bike for $500 or $600. And also, it turns out that the health benefits of cycling are so great that you save actually a lot on health costs, not only individual, but society as a whole. The least obvious of these 3 aspects of sustainability is the social sustainability. What do we mean by this? Well, part of it is equity and social justice. Almost virtually anyone can afford a bike, and it doesn't take that much in terms of repairing it, and you're just using your own energy you don't have to go and tank up with gas, thank goodness. It's physically possible for most people. There are people who, for various reasons, are not able to ride a bike, but for most people, it's physically possible. And then getting back to the health benefits, and we have a whole chapter on the health benefits, by the way, written by 4 public health professors, and they also have MDs as well as PhDs, and they document in great detail the really humongous physical, mental, and social health benefits from physical activity of cycling. So it's cycling is just about the perfect mode of transportation when it comes to sustainability. In fact, cycling is divine. Indeed, it's divine. And this is a photograph I took way back in the 1980s when I was a visiting professor at the University of Munster. Now, if cycling is so divine, you might wonder, well, why is it that in English-speaking countries, only 1 to 2% of trips are by bike? And that's what you see on the left-hand part of this graphic. In the United States, forget the 0.6, that's for the only for the commute to work, but for all trip purposes, exactly 1.0% of trips are by bicycle in the United States, 1.4% Australia, 1.4% in Canada, 1.7% in the UK, that's about 2% in Ireland. Very low levels, not indication that bicycling is irresistible. But if you then go over to continental Europe, you find much, much higher levels of cycling, the highest, not a surprise, 28% of all trips in the Netherlands. And these are all the latest available national travel surveys, the official government information. So 28% of all trips in the Netherlands, all trip purposes, are by bike, 14% in Denmark, 11% in Germany, 9%, and so forth. The point is much, much higher, well, actually, in the case of the Netherlands, it's about 25, 30 times higher than in these English-speaking countries. Also, you'll see it's 13% in Japan. That might surprise you, but 13% of all trips are by bike in Japan. And in Tokyo, it's 17%. So a lot, but there's big differences, as you can see. And it's not all due to differences in trip distance. Some of you probably think, oh, well, you know, our suburbanized, sprawled metropolitan areas in the United States have such long trip distances. That's the explanation as to why Americans cycle so little compared to these other countries. But that's not it. I mean, it is true that average trip distances are longer in the United States than in, say, European countries. But in spite of that being true, 40% of all trips in the United States, in metropolitan areas, are 2 miles or shorter, and 2 miles or less is a very, very easy distance to cover by bike. So that's not the main reason. And then to look at it another way, even when you control for trip distance, that is, look within each trip distance category. And what this slide is showing you that no matter what the trip distance category, the level of cycling in the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark is about 10 to 20 times higher than it is in the United States. So even whether it's a short trip, a medium distance, or long trip, the level of cycling is much, much, much higher in these other countries, and especially what I'm showing here, Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. And that's because they make cycling safe and convenient and low stress. The good news we see here in this chart is that cycling has been increasing a lot. If you look at I guess it's like 20 of these cities, these are all large cities, those that are now bracketed, they started out with very little in the way of cycling, I mean, almost nothing. And they managed to increase either double or even up to a 10-fold increase. If you look at Seville, Spain, Vienna, Portland, and so forth, huge increase. I mean, as a percentage at least, 2 to 10-fold increases from those low levels of cycling. So lots and lots of progress being made in the Americas and Australia and so forth, and also South America in terms of raising cycling levels. The other impressive thing is if you look then at these next bracketed cities here, these are in Europe, these cities did have cycling cultures. They did have fairly high levels of cycling, but they still managed to have big increases. I mean, just look at Copenhagen and Amsterdam. I think, well, they just always had that level of cycling that they do now. Well, they had a fairly high level, but look how much it's increased, especially look at Amsterdam. It's almost a doubling in Amsterdam, and you might not think that was possible, but it is. So increase is a very, very hopeful sign throughout the world is a lot of increasing in cycling in some of these large sort of Western cities.
And even though not part of the book, part of another study we just completed, we saw some of the potential of cycling and increases of cycling during the COVID pandemic. This graph here shows you cycling levels in various countries in 2020 compared to 2019. Whenever we are above this black zero line here, it means more cycling in 2020 compared to 2019. And you see there's quite some variability, but overall we are above that zero line. We have big declines here. And by the way, on the horizontal axis here, we have the weeks of the year. You see around week 14, 15, 16, 17, we have these big dips here. And that's for European countries that had very severe lockdowns, where you were not allowed to leave your house unless you had a specific purpose where you had to go, or you were not allowed to leave a certain radius around your home. And cycling sort of plummeted during that time and then shot up once these lockdowns were lifted. A couple of key findings from our international comparison of the impacts of COVID on cycling are that we saw overall increases in cycling volumes and even larger increases in the percentage of trips made by bike, mainly because other modes, public transport, but also driving, dropped while bicycling held stable or increased. But there was much variation in the trends by month, time of day, time of year, location, and purpose. We saw large increases in cycling for exercise, recreation, getting outdoors, relief from stress. People wanted to be out, they wanted to be physically active. We saw decreases in utilitarian cycling because people worked from home, they went to school from home, they went to university from home, they didn't go shopping but had things delivered to them. So these bike trips, we didn't decrease, so we didn't find them. The largest increases in cycling we saw were on the weekend, less so for the weekday, precisely because of all of these utilitarian trips not being made during the week. And we saw that in particular when we looked at the morning peak hours. So typically bicycling in the morning has a peak with lots of people cycling to work, cycling to school, and then they come back in the afternoon. And that morning peak had a big decrease during the COVID pandemic, but there were increases in the afternoon peak where many people were out and were cycling to be physically active. The largest increases were on off-road recreational paths, but we saw decreases on main radial work commute corridors or central city or university campuses. There were decreases, as we saw in the graph before, in cycling during the total lockdowns, but we saw increases in other places where they had lockdowns that were not as severe or exempted cycling for physical activity. And in the places with the strict lockdowns, we saw sharp increases in cycling once the lockdowns were lifted. Cities have implemented a lot of bikeway infrastructure to facilitate bicycling during the COVID pandemic. There's a picture from the Rue de Rivoli in Paris, which has been converted essentially to a pedestrian and bicycle street with one lane for motorized traffic. This is from Montreal, Canada.
Back, Ralph. Could you just, the lane there is mainly for buses. So it's not that regular cars drive there. It's really buses and then mainly cyclists. Sorry.
This is from Montreal in Canada, where they installed 68 kilometers of new or improved cycling facilities in 2020. And they are mainly installed with physical separation, as you see here to the left. And they were installed to such a high standard that entire families are out cycling with their children. And many of these infrastructure measures were also made permanent. Other measures we can see here from the Boston area, and many of them are also familiar here from the area. We have closed streets that are only open for bicyclists and pedestrians. We have shared streets in neighborhoods where only local traffic can go in slowly and pedestrians and cyclists can use the area. We have outdoor dining and then new bike lanes next to it, or contraflow bike lanes on the upper left. So where cars can only drive one direction, but bikes can use the roadway in both directions. So many cities implemented measures to facilitate bicycling and physical activity. This is an example from the Boston area where we can nicely see what happens. So before July 2020, this was a roadway for cars mainly. There you can see some arrows here, suggestions that cyclists can use the road. And then during the COVID pandemic, they put in a pop-up bike lane and blocked off this space, and it was well used, and cyclists took to this facility, and then it was made permanent, and now is a cycle track that's protected from traffic.
So we have an entire chapter devoted to Latin America, which is a very important part of the world. There are no national surveys available at all for Latin America. So the three Latin American co-authors of this chapter, all of whom are experts on cycling in Latin America, looked at city data. They actually have a long-term sort of a city database for all sorts of travel behavior. And you can see there's huge variation from one city to another in levels of cycling, ranging from about 7 to 8%, looking at Bogota, Colombia, and Guadalajara, Mexico. And then at the other end, looking at Quito and Lima. So Quito and Lima, I think, are the capitals of their respective countries, 0.3%. So that's a huge, huge difference. So what you can't really generalize about what's happening with cycling in Latin America. It varies so much from city to city, and a lot of the reason for the difference is different policies in terms of to what extent there's this investment necessary, that whether it's made or not, in bicycle infrastructure. And there's also a new chapter in the book. This is one on India and China. And as Ralph noted, these are the two most populous countries in the world, so they're very, very important. This slide is probably the most depressing slide in the entire show, so brace yourselves. Because what it shows is fairly significant declines here in cycling in all of these. These are the largest, I think, of the Chinese cities. And the declines are even larger than they look, because in the last year, sort of the, I guess it's the darker green bar here, most of those cities are including e-bikes with the bicycles, and nothing against e-bikes, but most of the e-bikes in China, as we discovered, are in fact electric scooters without pedals. I'm not sure you can really call those bicycles, but in the official Chinese statistics, which is where these come from, they include those, even though they have no pedals, as bicycles. So the point is big declines in cycling in Chinese cities, and there are 4 reasons for this. One is, over this period, the Chinese government has made a massive, massive investment in new and expanded metro systems. I think 5 of the 10 largest metro systems in the world are now in Chinese cities. So you have big, big, big competition now from vastly improved public transit. They also bus rapid transit as well as metro systems. They just vastly improved public transit. Another reason is big increases, percentage increases in per capita income in China, which means big increases in car ownership and car use. And to accommodate the big increases in car ownership and use, Chinese cities and the Chinese government in general, also the national government, has gone hog wild. Well, that's a term for the Piedmont either. And they've gone hog wild, building roadways of every kind. I think Beijing now has 4 superhighway beltways and all sorts of highways crisscrossing in between. So a huge investment in roadways, which of course encouraged even more car use. And then on top of that, these cities are all very rapidly growing. Cities such as Shanghai, Beijing, at 25, 30 million people. And so they've spread out as well. So you have, because they're become so large, the trip distances have vastly increased. Which also then makes cycling a somewhat less feasible way to cover those trip distances. It's also another reason why almost all the bicycles that people do use, these e-bikes, are in fact motorized. They're electric, but they are motorized. So China, the national government has now issued policies. They'd like to turn this around. But it's going to take a while. They're helping invest new bike infrastructure in the Chinese cities, but it's going to take a while. In India, the other country in that chapter, about 20% of all trips are by bike, which is not that much less than you have in Denmark. I think Denmark was, I can't remember what exactly, actually more than in Denmark. It's a lot. I mean, 20%, and that's 1.4 billion people. That's a lot of bicyclists. And by the way, bicycling is at a higher rate in the rural areas than in urban areas. And this is partly because people have lower incomes in rural areas. So they're less likely to be able to afford a car or even public transit, actually. Also, you have smaller cities. And we found this also in some of the Europe. Sometimes the bicycle is an even more feasible mode of transportation in a smaller city than a larger city because the trip distance is shorter. But anyway, looking here, what we have in this graph is the largest cities, in fact, in India, and you can see huge variation. So let's just take the largest 3, Mumbai, Delhi, and Kolkata. And Here you have in Kolkata, what is it, almost 12 times the bicycle percentage of trips as you have in Mumbai. And there's all sorts of reasons for this. One is there's a much lower per capita income in Kolkata than there is in Mumbai, which is the financial capital of India. The other is public transportation in Mumbai is much, much better, the best really in India, and it's lousy in Kolkata, and reasons too. But the whole point is lots and lots of variation. Ralph?
So if we want to promote bicycling, we have to promote to the largest group possible, and so that includes all ages. And we can indeed ride our bikes at all ages, from the very young to into old age. Sometimes we may need a special bicycle with 3 tires, but even then we may use the additional space for carrying bags or carrying groceries. You can ride for utilitarian purposes, but you can also go, as on the lower right, go out for a bike ride for recreation. Cycling varies by age. But there are also, again, these big differences between countries. In the US and the UK, cycling falls with increasing age, and those 70 years and older only make fewer than 1% of their trips by bicycle. If we look at the other countries here, Japan, Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, we see that the highest percentage of trips by bike is for those that are not at driving age yet, and then it drops. But after that, it stays fairly high within these countries. So in Japan, Germany, and Denmark, about 10 to 12% of trips by those 70 years and older are made by bicycle. In the Netherlands, if you look all the way to the right, almost a quarter of the trips of those 70 years and older are made by bicycle. And that's a huge number. So you can really cycle even into older age. Another big difference internationally is the share of women making trips by bicycle, as John has already alluded before. In the English-speaking countries here, Australia, the UK, the US, and Canada, only about a quarter to a third of bike trips are made by women. But in the other countries we see here, it's about half or even more than half of bike trips made by women. And if we want to increase cycling and want to appeal to everyone, we also have to appeal to women. And then, as the cover photo of the book already showed, in countries like Denmark or the Netherlands, over 50% of bike trips are made by women. Another big trend we are seeing is a trend towards e-bikes, and most e-bikes in the countries displayed here are so-called pedelecs. So these are bicycles where you get electric assist only when you pedal. So they're different from the ones that John described for China, where you don't have pedals anymore, you just have a throttle. Most of these have pedals, and you get the electric support while you're pedaling, and you see an increase even before COVID, and during COVID it was even more in all of these countries. Germany has the strongest increase here, but other countries are following suit, and we'll see a continued increase in e-bikes in the bicycle fleet.
Well, in order to get more people cycling, it is absolutely crucial to make it safer. To make it safer, in fact, and also to change the perceptions that Americans, but also Brits and Canadians and Australians have that cycling is dangerous. Because as is shown actually in the health chapter, these 4 public health professors looked at all the studies, and they show that even given whatever the risks are, even in these English-speaking countries with not so much cycling, the health benefits of cycling far, far, far outweigh the potential health risks in terms of injuries and deaths. Cycling safety is important for everyone, of course, but it's especially important for the young, for older adults, for anyone with disabilities, for anyone who is timid or risk averse. And I am very risk averse, so I really, it's very important to me that cycling be safe. And it turns out all the surveys show that women are much more sensitive to safety than men. That's a generalization. I'm at least as sensitive to safety as most women. And I think if you look at the safety of cycling, we'll show you this in just a second. Cycling is in fact much safer, like 7 times as safe in the Netherlands per mile cycled, Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany, than it is in the United States. And it's the safety of cycling, and much, almost an order of magnitude safer cycling in these European countries that explains why you have such a high percentage of women cycling, why you have so many young people cycling, and why you have older adults cycling. And this relationship is between the amount of cycling. There's a very important relationship between the amount of cycling and the safety of cycling. So as you might expect, the United States is the worst of all possible worlds. We not only have the least cycling, we also have the most dangerous cycling. So the danger of cycling fatalities per 100 million kilometers cycled is shown on the vertical axis, and amount of cycling per year is shown on the horizontal axis. So the Netherlands is the best of all possible worlds when it comes to cycling. They have the most cycling per capita, and they have the lowest fatality rate per amount cycled. So this is a phenomenon that people in the sort of the cycling area call safety in numbers, meaning the following: that the more cycling you get, the safer cycling becomes, but also the relationship that goes in the other direction. The safer cycling is, the more cycling you encourage. So it's sort of literally a virtuous cycle. More cycling leads to safer cycling, and also safer cycling to more cycling. And you can see this also when you compare these 5 countries. I already noted that cycling is so much safer in the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany, and indeed it is. It is indeed 7 times safer. All 3 of those countries, Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, cycling in the United States is 7 times more dangerous per mile, or it doesn't make any difference whether it's miles or kilometers for its comparison, but per 100 million kilometers cycled, it's 7 times more dangerous in the United States. What's even more, there's two other factors that I think are important in this graph. One is in the UK, Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, dramatic progress in making cycling safer and safer and safer. So look at the UK. They went from 4.0 to 1.6. That's like a 60% or something reduction in their cyclist fatality rate per mile cycled. Germany, a halving of the rate, so twice as safe. And Denmark, more than a halving of the rate. So in the Netherlands, I don't know what that is, a 60% reduction in the rate. Unfortunately, you look at the United States, not only are we worse compared to these other countries, but look what's happened between the last 2 time periods. We've increased, I'm not sure what that percentage is, but from 4.5 to 6.0 fatalities per 100 million kilometers cycled. And you might think this is a statistical error, or we made a mistake in our calculations. Unfortunately, it's not a mistake. Everything confirms that this is in fact the case. And the reasons are that over this time period, so there's roughly, I think it's roughly 2010 to 2018 is the time period that we got a huge increase in very large personal light trucks, personal vehicles that are light trucks, either SUVs, mega pickup trucks. I mean, nothing like I remember in the 50s or 60s. These are humongous, high-powered pickup trucks. And then you have minivans as well. And so you have bigger vehicles, more powerful vehicles. And we looked at in lots of studies, the bigger the vehicle, the more the danger it poses to cyclists. And by the way, also to pedestrians. Another issue here is there was an increase in vehicle miles traveled over this period. Yet another reason for the increase in the United States is a dramatic epidemic, really, of distracted driving, texting, cell phone use, you name it, and very complicated dashboards that, I mean, just doing anything is a distraction there. But there's yet a 4th reason, as if you might wonder why it's not even worse in the United States, and that is drunk driving, or the Brits call it drink driving. Driving under the influence is about 3 to 4 times more important or more serious a factor in terms of cycling fatalities, motorists, that is, being drunk, than it is in these other countries. So in every respect, we are really a basket case, I must say, the United States, when it comes to traffic safety. And by the way, it's even become more dangerous being a motorist inside a car. So, I mean, no matter what mode you're talking about, it's become more dangerous. Okay, Ralph's giving me the hand here to go on, or I will never finish. Okay, there's a whole chapter on New York, Paris and London. And I worked with two, well, a French and also a British colleague on this chapter. And you can see big increases in cycling over time. This is as a percentage of all trips. They're not huge percentages. I mean, none of these are Amsterdam or Copenhagen, but still, these are very, very big, important international cities. So in New York, you have almost a fourfold increase in cycling as a share of trips. In London, you have a doubling. And in Paris, the winner, Paris has, I think it's a 12-fold increase in cycling, maybe even more than that. But anyway, a huge increase in cycling in Paris. And again, we have this phenomenon. The more cycling you get, the safer it gets, and the safer it gets, the more cycling you get. So in every single one of these three mega cities, you have big improvements in cycling safety. Look at New York, it's something like 3 times safer in 2017 as it was in 2000. This is controlling for the amount of cycling. So it's like per gazillion bike trips. Well, probably not a gazillion. Okay, London, the same thing. Every single one of these, and you can see two different measures of safety. One is looking at fatality rates, so a number of cyclist fatalities per amount of cycling, per number of bike trips, and the other is serious injury rates. And the way these are defined in the statistics is requiring overnight hospitalization. So that's how serious it has to be included. But whether it's fatality rates or serious injury rates, it's improved vastly in all three of these cities. But I would note, Paris is again here the winner. As you can see, it's by far the safest in Paris compared to these other, compared to New York and London. And this is one of the ways that London, Paris, and New York have made cycling safer and have so increased cycling, and that is a massive trend in building completely separate, physically protected, physically separated bicycling facilities that is separated from motor vehicle traffic. I think you can recognize these cities, the Eiffel Tower, Big Ben, and upper left is New York City. And it is a very, very, you don't see the Empire State Building, but it is a very typical street scene in New York City. I think it's 8th Avenue looking south. But it is, not only is it separated from motor vehicles, but then at intersections, there are special facilities such as, there's just, you can see the special green bike light. And when that's green, and you can see the other light, cars cannot turn left. And that's very good for the cyclists because it means the cars can't run over the cyclists. So there are also many intersections with signs, no left turn, no right turn, and basically giving the cyclist priority at intersections, and then between intersections, having them physically separated.
So what are policies to encourage more cycling while improving its safety? And John already alluded to the better cycling facilities, but it also includes traffic calming of residential neighborhoods where cars and bicycles can share because of low car travel volumes and low speeds, mixed-use zoning to keep the trip distances short enough to be made by bike, integration of bicycling with public transport, of course, restrictions on motor vehicle use, that's speed and volume of motor vehicles, improved traffic education for motorists and also for cyclists, traffic regulations and enforcement, as well as special events and promotional campaigns. And I'll talk about a couple of these in the following slides. The first slide here shows you for about 20 cities here in Europe, North America, and South America, the growth in their cycling facilities they have built over the time frame stated there, about a 10-20-year time frame. And along with that, in the darker color, you see the growth in the increase in cycling. So all of these cities who have built these facilities have increased their cycling levels. The variability is partly due to pre-existing bike networks, if they're adding or if they're starting out completely new. But then importantly, all of these cities, while they're building the facilities and increasing cycling, they've reduced the fatality and severe injury rates relative to the cycling levels. These are the black bars that are all going down. So cycling has gotten safer per kilometer cycled in all of these cities. In the US, we're also having more of these protected bike lanes, or cycle tracks, as they are sometimes called. This shows you the increase in mileage in the US from 2006 to 2018. And we have a 14-fold increase. And these were the latest data we could get. We have informally seen newer data, and we've seen that this has gone even more up and up since then. So also this safe infrastructure being built here in the US. This is what it looks like. On the upper left, we see it in Copenhagen. If you look all the way to the back, you see it's a little curb. So the cycle track is on a curb, separated from car traffic. And then there's another curb separating the cyclists from the pedestrians. On the upper right, we have an application from Bogota in Colombia with these yellow caps here, sort of protecting cyclists from drivers or cars that may want to come into that lane. On the lower left, we have Montreal, Canada. That was the first North American city with a network of these cycle tracks. And there they are protecting cyclists with a concrete barrier, as we see here to the left. And then on the lower right, it's in Seville, Spain, where they built a fence to protect the cyclists from the motorists. Going to another part of the world, this is Sydney and Brisbane in Australia. And again, we see these cycle tracks separated from motor vehicle traffic with greenery and planters here. Another important element of this graph here shows you on the upper left, bicycling bridge. Bridges are often the hardest barriers for cyclists, because you cannot cross a river or a highway if there's not a bridge that is built to accommodate bicyclists. So it's very important to have bridges that either are solely for pedestrians and cyclists or that accommodate bicyclists. These pictures may be familiar to some of you. These are from Richmond and Charlottesville, Virginia, again showing separate cycling facility and how they are carried through intersections in two of these cases. A new trend in bicycling infrastructure are so-called bicycle expressways. They typically connect the suburbs to the city center. They separate pedestrians and cyclists, and they avoid crossing roadways at grade. So whenever you're crossing a larger roadway, you have a bridge or you have a tunnel. This has two main effects. The first is it speeds up cycling because you do not have to wait at a traffic light. And the second is it increases safety because you do not have to cross these intersections where drivers may not look out for you or may hit you. So they increase speed and they increase safety. Emphasizing speed on the upper left here, that's in Freiburg, Germany, they have used this blue color and the white logo in it, and that's the logo that's used in Germany for the Autobahn, where the cars can go really fast, and so they are now trying to market that as a bicycle highway. In the center here, we see what they have done in Beijing in China as part of promoting bicycling again. They have built an elevated bicycle expressway that is above the buildings of the city, sort of facilitating smooth bike riding without crossing any intersections and speeding up bike traffic. Some of these facilities sort of exist in the US already. The lower left is the Cherry Creek Trail in Denver, where parts of the trail separate pedestrians from cyclists. The Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis partly separates pedestrians from cyclists. And then we have the Minuteman Trail in Boston. But they are not true bicycle expressways, but they're sort of similar facilities. This is a map of the city of Amsterdam. And here's what a mature bicycling network looks like. Everything you see here in red are separated bikeways for cyclists. If you look very closely, you see some things that are marked in orange. These are future plans for expansion. But so this is the bicycling network for the city of Amsterdam. And on top of that, you have traffic calmed roadways in the neighborhoods where cyclists and motorists can share the road space. So this is what a large bike-friendly city looks like. And by the way, Amsterdam is a large bike-friendly city, but it's not the most bike-friendly city in the Netherlands. If you go to smaller cities in the Netherlands, they will tell you that Amsterdam is pretty bad for bicyclists. So it can be even better than what we see here. Other cities are following Amsterdam's example. And we see two examples here. On the upper, we see Portland, Oregon. And on the lower, we see Seville in Spain, both cities without a bicycling history. And in the 1990s, in black, here you see the bike facilities in Portland, Oregon, and they were not that many. The same here in Seville, Spain. Here the color is green. You see the bikeway facilities they had. 10 years on in Portland, you see how the bike network has grown quite a bit. And only 3 years on down here in Seville, you see how the bike network has really expanded very, very rapidly. Again, adding another 5 years for Portland, you see how the bike network has gotten more and more dense. By the way, the colors in the background show you the level of bicycling for the Portland map. So you also see that it goes from light color through yellow to red to brown, indicating more and more cycling. And also on the lower right, you see how the bike network has truly expanded in Seville, Spain, also with increasing cycling levels. In part, the attention is now turning away from just focusing on the bikeways, but also focusing on the intersections, how to accommodate cyclists at intersections. And this is a Google Street View or Google shot from the internet of a Dutch-style protected intersection in Salt Lake City. So it's an import from the Netherlands. And the key element to safety here are these things that we labeled safety islands. And this is how it works. When a motor vehicle starts and wants to make a right-hand turn, the changed curve radius here to the safety island slows down the motor vehicle, forces a very slow turn, and by slowing things down, it enables the driver and the cyclist to avoid a crash because they can stop or they can swerve. And if there is a crash, it's a low-speed crash and a less of an impact crash. In addition, by having the motorist go this extra distance here, there is a larger chance of the motorist to actually see the cyclist, especially if the bicycle gets an advanced green light to be in the intersection before the motor vehicle gets there. On top of that, the crossing distance for the bike here, while it could be hit by cars, is shorter than it would be for a normal intersection. Once the cyclists are across, they can start queuing here and wait for a green signal to make a left turn, essentially, or they can continue on straight and leave the intersection.
Most cycling, especially by children, is in residential neighborhoods. And in European cities, over half of all residential streets are traffic calmed. And in some cities, for example, in Berlin and Vienna and Munich, it's more like 85% of streets are traffic calmed. What do we mean by traffic calming? It's the installation of specific infrastructure to slow down cars or to deter cars from coming into a residential neighborhood at all. We sort of, here in the United States, we're familiar with speed humps and speed bumps. But there's many, many other things you can do. You can have artificial dead ends. You can have diverters, they're called. You can have curvy streets. You can do all sorts of things to slow the different pavement, raised intersections, raised crosswalks, and so forth. The crucial thing is that 30 kilometers an hour, which is about 20 miles an hour, is the crucial speed beyond which the risk or the likelihood of getting killed by a car increases exponentially, as you can see. And once you get up to 35 miles an hour, which is the usual speed limit around here in Raleigh, North Carolina, even in residential neighborhoods, you've just about had it. That's just about a 90% chance that if a car hits you, you're going to get killed. Whereas if it were 30 kilometers an hour, 20 miles an hour, the likelihood is about 10%. So it's, by the way, the main beneficiary, by the way, of residential traffic calming is children. Lots of studies have been done on this before and after traffic calming. 60 to 80% reduction in child fatalities in the neighborhoods where they live once traffic calming is instituted. Not only that, it reduces through traffic, it reduces noise, it reduces air pollution, and it most certainly encourages both walking and cycling. It encourages kids playing in the streets. This is one particular kind of traffic calming where you not only do you reduce car speeds and you also reduce through traffic in neighborhoods, but what you do is you set up these particular bicycling routes. They used to be called bike boulevards and now being rebranded as neighborhood greenways. But what they do is the stop signs, for example, you're more on the streets that are perpendicular. And there are all sorts of cut-throughs, for example, for cyclists, as you see in Vancouver to the lower left. And often you don't see the dead end here, but on many streets throughout, even in North America, you see artificial diverters, they're called. So it makes it impossible for motor vehicles to drive through residential neighborhoods, but there are these cut-throughs for cyclists as well as pedestrians, of course. So it shortens the route for cyclists, but it lengthens the route and slows down the route for cars, which is what it should be.
Two other important policies to promote bicycling are integration with public transportation and bicycle parking. Integration with public transportation is important to make longer trips or longer distances, and you're using the bicycle for the first mile or last mile. This can be done either by, as we see on the upper right, allowing bikes to be brought on vehicles. About 80% of buses in the US have bike racks in front of them, and you can transport a bike on these racks while you're riding the bus. Some rail systems, as you see in the lower left from Vancouver, allow you to bring bikes on board of the vehicles. This is often restricted to the off-peak hours when not so many people are riding, or to certain cars of the train, or certain doors. Another element is to allow bicycles to be parked securely at transit stops or train stations. On the upper left, we have the bike station at Union Station in Washington, DC. On the left center, we have Freiburg in Germany, and there you can see that they are often for pay. So you pay either on a daily basis, or you pay with a monthly or an annual fee to park there, and then the bike is protected from the weather, it's protected from vandalism, it's protected from theft. And then a really big bike parking garage you see here in Groningen at the train station again. We've seen some studies looking at the cost of parking at train stations, and the higher the cost is, the less likely people are to park in this. So if this is free, people are even more likely to park there. Bike parking can also be throughout the city. Here we see from Portland, Oregon, at the lower part of the screen, they took out 2 car parking spaces and built bike parking for 20 bikes. And on the lower right, we sort of have deluxe bike parking in Nagoya in Japan. We have an automated bicycle parking machine where you enter your bicycle, you receive a code, the bike goes in, it goes down, it's being parked, and when you want to retrieve it, you retrieve it with your code, and within a minute or so, the bike emerges and is back in your hands.
Ralph, just one point. Could you go back to Nagoya, Japan? I'm not sure if I would describe it as deluxe parking, but it's mega bike parking. These are always at rail stations of one sort or another, either suburban rail or metro stations. Some of these hold tens of thousands of bikes. So it's crucial, in fact, to have this technology. So it makes dropping off your bike and getting it back much, much faster.
This slide shows other complementary policies to promote bicycling. One of them is ciclovías. These are events that last a couple of hours, an entire day, a weekend, or a week, where certain roadways are closed off for motorized traffic, and they're given over to pedestrians, cyclists, inline skaters to experience that space without motorized traffic, and to envision what it would be like if it wouldn't be dominated by motorized traffic. Bike sharing has been successful in attracting new cyclists to riding bikes, mainly because bike sharing relieves you from fearing about bike theft. You don't have to do any bike maintenance, and bike parking is quite easy because you drop it off at the bike sharing station, especially if you live in an apartment or up several flights of stairs and you don't want to carry the bike up there. There are many events like Bike to Work Day. There's one coming up here in the US. It's in May, where employers sort of with other groups together promote cycling to work in the hope that employees keep cycling or will cycle for more trips to work after that. There are also Bike to School Days. The one in Virginia was just last week. Bike training is important. In Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark, most children have bike training in school in 3rd or 4th grade. They first learn in the classroom, and then they go to these traffic gardens where they learn how to ride a bike and obeying traffic signals and other things. And then sometimes police come and take the children out into the real world and cycle with them in real traffic. It's not only training for children, it's also training for adults. That's important, especially in a country like the US, where many adults may not have ridden for many years and they're not comfortable riding anymore. So having bike training for adults to get reacquainted with riding a bike is important. And of course, the other side is training motorists. When motorists get a driver's license, they have to learn about what are the rights of the road for bicyclists and pedestrians. Where are they allowed to cycle? And importantly, they have to learn that motorists have to yield to bicyclists and respect their their rights. And then last,
Ralph, one point is that in Germany, over a third attempts on your license exam have to do with how you drive to avoid endangering pedestrians and cyclists. On the exam I took to get my motor vehicle license here in North Carolina, I don't even remember one.
And then to round out this slide, and we'll finish up very soon. Don't worry. Many cities are implementing, following the example of Copenhagen in Denmark, and implementing these things called bicycle accounts. These are typically biannual reports that report on the extent of bike infrastructure, on bicycling safety, on bicycling counts and other objective data. And they also include surveys of the entire population of the city or representative for the cyclists, and ask them about their satisfaction with the bikeways, the condition of the bikeways, safety, etc. And then cities often use these answers to the surveys as part of their policy making or their policy goals. So they may say, we want to be a 4.5 out of 5 in bikeway safety in 5 years or something like that. And they work towards these goals.
Well, as we have learned, as I've learned over 25 years of doing research on cycling, academics, engineers, planners can have the best ideas in the world. If you can't implement them, they're useless. So we devote, in fact, half of the concluding chapter of the book to strategies for implementing the right kinds of infrastructure and policies and programs. I think one thing that's crucial is widely publicizing to the public as a whole both the individual and the societal benefits of cycling, whether they're environmental benefits, health benefits, making cities more livable. Encourage citizen participation when it comes to bike planning and implementation. My goodness, I'm not even drinking any wine. Implementing the right kinds of policies, you want to make sure it feels involved in the decision making, that it's not something imposed on them. The other thing is implementing controversial policies in stages. An example we showed there on Boylston Street in Boston, you try out in sort of a trial project, and if it works, make it permanent. Make bike plans, long-term, short-term, update them. It's crucial to combine incentives for cycling, better bike infrastructure, pro-bike programs, but what's crucial is also disincentives for car use, such as traffic calm, reducing the speed limit, making through traffic impossible, making parking cars more expensive or more difficult. And it's also really crucial that bicycling groups form alliances with other sustainability advocates, such as there in your area, Charlottesville, but also with politicians. I mean, some people don't like politicians, but you know what? They're the ones that end up adopting laws that are needed and also funding to implement the kind of bike infrastructure programs and policies that are necessary. Bike advocacy is crucial. So if there's anyone out there in the audience who is with the bike advocacy organization, thank you, because it's through the bicycling advocacy at the state, local, and the national level that is absolutely crucial in convincing politicians to do and to generate the public support also, but to get politicians also aware of the importance of the right policies for promoting cycling, and also, as Ralph mentioned before, benchmarking success over time. Summary lessons, and then we're finished, believe it or not. An absolutely crucial, absolutely necessary ingredient in any of these policies is, first of all, providing safe cycling infrastructure or environment. So for example, a low speed, traffic calm neighborhood street with very little traffic, you don't really need any cycling infrastructure. So that's a kind of a cycling facility or place just on its own without cycling infrastructure. But on any high speed road with heavy traffic, you definitely need separate safe cycling infrastructure. That is absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient. So you really do have to combine that with all that whole range of policies and programs that we talked about in the previous slides, including, of course, those disincentives for car use and in particular lower speed limits. And by the way, during COVID, many cities have done just exactly this. They have imposed serious restrictions on motorists, shared streets, car-free streets, over 100 miles of car-free streets in New York City alone. Can you imagine? From 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. I mean, that would have been unthinkable a while back. Cities have reduced their speed limits to 20 miles an hour. Okay, anyway, it's necessary to put the brakes on drivers, literally. The last point here we want, and it's a theme that runs throughout the entire book, every single chapter, and of course the chapter that's devoted to equity and social justice. It is absolutely crucial, both in building bicycling infrastructure, in designing cycling programs, in sort of the citizen participation and the decision-making on what kinds of cycling programs and infrastructure should be built, that we need to include people of color, neighborhoods, communities of color and of lower income, of their various ethnicities in that decision-making process, that cycling really should be for everyone, and that it's a matter of equity and social justice to make cycling safe and convenient and attractive and a feasible way to get around cities. It's a crucial means of mobility, especially for people with low income, but it's also a crucial means, a crucial form of physical activity for the entire population. And I really do think it makes cities much more livable. And that's why I think the sustainability in our title really makes sense, because cycling really, in so many different ways, economically, socially, from a health point of view, and of course, environmentally, make our cities more livable and more sustainable. And if you would like to have more information, we go into this in excruciating detail. No, actually, it's very entertaining, I could tell, in our book, Cycling for Sustainable Cities with MIT Press. So thanks to each and every one of you for putting up with our much too long presentation. How we went this far over is beyond me. I guess I got carried away, as I usually do. I'm a North Carolinian, I'm a Tar Heel. What do you expect?
Well, that certainly was a lot of information, and I definitely would encourage folks to pick up the book, because there were lots of data points in there, and I don't think anyone expected you to retain that. We'll be sharing the video to everybody, and one question I got in the chat from somebody is if it would be possible to have a copy of your slides, perhaps as a PDF, or people could simply watch your video, the video of this. Which would you prefer?
We have to see. I think PDF may work, because the strange thing when you write a book is that the copyright of whatever you do, all these graphs, goes to MIT Press. So we have to check. Maybe a PDF is possible, but we have to be careful in even the photos. Everything sort of goes goes to them.
We're actually pretty sure that MIT Press won't allow it, but they'll certainly allow the videotape of the talk.
And of course, we have the book, and the library has copies of the book. Okay, so thank you for that terrific presentation. Yay! So I'd like to take questions from the audience. Ralph and John have agreed to hang out until, well, they said 6:30. I don't know if we can retain them for a while after that too, but definitely till then. So to ask questions, use the raise your hand function, which should be under the participants window.
Dogs are allowed to raise their paws. So if Leo, Gary and Elisa's dog, wants to ask a question, Leo can raise his paw.
I see Rachel's got her hand raised, and I'm glad that she's asking a question, because I was hoping we could start with a female, because women are so central in this book. Go ahead, Rachel.
Thanks. Hi, great presentation. I look forward to reading your book. I was wondering what effective signage comes to mind to really alert drivers to start thinking about bicycles all the time. A sign that says, look for bikes. What cities have signs that really are working?
Ralph?
I'm not sure it's going to be a sign that will solve the problem. There are various signs that alert drivers to cyclists, but there are also all sorts of other warning signs and things. But I think what it needs is a culture change among the drivers. And part of what John talked about, the safety in numbers issue, has to do with that culture change. So as you get more cyclists in a community, drivers get more aware of the cyclists because they are either themselves a cyclist for some trips, they know cyclists who are their friends, and they get used to other people being on bikes. And by doing that, they will start watching out for bikes. They'll start looking over the right-hand shoulder before making a right-hand turn. They look over the left-hand shoulder before opening a car door. But I don't think that a sign alone will bring about that change. That change will happen as more and more people ride bikes and more people cycle in the community.
I have something. I think there's a more important strategy, Rachel. It's a good question, by the way, really good question. But I think it's in vastly better motorist training. I'll go ahead and I hope this embarrasses Ralph, but he failed the first time when he took the driver license test in Germany. He failed not because he disobeyed any particular law or ran anybody over. He failed because the instructor said he was not actively anticipating the possibility of endangering a pedestrian who was on the sidewalk and may have darted out into the street. And that was enough to make him fail the test. So in Germany, it is your responsibility as a motorist to proactively anticipate the possibility of a bicyclist or a pedestrian, especially this is true, by the way, for children and for older adults. If you as a motorist hit a child or older adult on a bike or as a pedestrian, you are automatically guilty and you are in big, deep trouble. I mean, huge fines, jail time. I mean, you're in trouble. You get lots of points on your license and so forth. So there's in the motorist training, by the way, there's many hours. This is not something like, I remember David and I, my friend in Virginia, we had free motorist training in high school here in Raleigh. And you know, it wasn't that many hours. It wasn't that thorough. It wasn't that rigorous. In Germany and the Netherlands and Denmark and all of Scandinavia, motorist training is extremely rigorous. It is extremely strictly tested. And also another issue is police enforcement. And that is one of the reasons motorists do watch out for pedestrians and cyclists is it's really enforced by the police. And here, at least in North Carolina, I've never ever seen a motorist get a ticket for violating the rights of way of pedestrians and cyclists.
Awesome, thank you. And that sort of leads up to something that Bill was asking in the chat. And please feel free to share your question, Bill.
Sure, thanks. Great presentation. I was wondering if the culture war of bikes versus motorists here in the US plays out in other countries. And also if that really matters, or in terms of whether people bike, whether there's support for biking, or is it just something that really occurs in the background? So I'd like to hear what goes on outside the US.
There exists conflict between cyclists and drivers, between drivers and pedestrians in other countries as well. I don't know if it's as extreme as we sometimes see it here in the US, but the conflict exists. The conflict exists when car parking is taken away for a bike lane. That conflict exists in other circumstances as well. So it is there as well in other countries, maybe not as extreme as it is here in the US. I also think that there's something funny going on in individual psychology. The same person who on a bike may yell at a driver will yell at a bicyclist when they're in a car as a driver. So something happens when you when you get part of, of your mode of transport, you sort of want this mode to be the one that succeeds or that is the most dominant. I'm not a psychologist, but it's a very interesting thing that I have observed among cyclists and among non-cyclists. But the culture wars, in that sense, they exist. Fights around parking and other things sort of subside over time when there are more cyclists and when there are better offerings, when people don't have to drive to certain destinations. When you can say, well, there's a good public transport system, there's a good bikeway system that's safe, how you can get there. It's easier to take away car parking because you have provided good alternatives. It's much harder if you have a car-dependent population and then you take away the parking at the destination of their trip.
The response to that question, and that is, if you remember the picture on the cover of the book and what those people looked like, they were wearing everyday clothing. They looked like normal people. They looked like you and me. I mean, like anyone. They didn't have special bikes. They didn't have special clothing. And they did not look like they came from outer space. And when you look at many cyclists here in the United States, they look like they just came from Mars. I mean, they're wearing these weird outfits and super duper racing bikes with all sorts of technical equipment. And it's like, well, it's like a different race. It's another planet. It's like seeing Martians. And it's like, it's no wonder that motorists don't identify with people in these weird outfits unless you happen to be one of them yourself. I mean, even I don't wear any of that stuff, so I'm not guilty of it. I bike the way the Dutch do, which is not very fast. I go about 10 miles an hour. But I think, you know, it's in a way, it's almost, for some, to some extent, it's almost like a cult here in the United States. And I wish we could make it an everyday, normal way to get around cities, and that we would just be, it would be safe enough that we could just wear regular clothing.
One more comment on the culture war thing is I read a study recently from, I think it was from Denmark, where they looked at a stretch of roadway with intersections and that traffic violations by drivers and by cyclists. And the perception is that cyclists violate traffic rules much more than drivers do. And what they found out is that there were more traffic violations by the drivers than for cyclists, but the perception was different for various reasons. One is cyclists were more likely to go through a red light or through a stop sign, which is a highly visible traffic violation, while drivers were speeding very often, which is very hard to see if you're going 40 miles or 30 miles per hour. And drivers were on the phone much more than the cyclists were, which is also very hard to see and very hard to find. But the point is, in the public perception, the cyclist is seen to do something, and cyclists then are sort of seen as the people who do not obey the law, and therefore they should be policed or should be punished. And I thought it was an interesting study. I had not seen anything like that before, looking at the types of violation in the same corridor.
I just can't resist following that up. Sorry, Peter. There was a study for New York City. It looked at, I think it was 3 or 4 years, 1,000 pedestrian or cyclist fatalities. These are not just serious injuries, fatalities over a 3 or 4 year period. And they examined the police. And what they found is that about a third of the 100% the fault of the motorist, and about a third of the cases it was definitely the fault of the cyclist or the pedestrian, meaning they were jaywalking or whatever. And in a third of the cases it was mixed responsibility. In only 1% of those 1,000 cases of pedestrian cyclist fatalities were there any serious sanctions of any kind imposed on the motorist. And in only 5% did the police even issue citations. That sends a message to motorists. You can get away with murder. And I personally think well, maybe murder is a little bit of a strong word, but it's negligent homicide. And I mean, there's no message going out to motorists during driving training. The police aren't enforcing the laws, and even if there are caught, there's almost no penalty. It's a real problem. Sorry.
Thank you. I think there is, again, a lot in there. Building on what you spoke about with the tribes and even people wearing uniforms and sort of setting themselves apart as cyclists. What about conflicts between cyclists and pedestrians? I feel like in America, cyclists decided to be part of the swimming pool of vehicles. And in Europe, they made a different decision and aligned themselves more closely with pedestrians. Is there, what can you say about sort of the idea of whether cyclists and pedestrians are in the same boat and are natural allies?
I think I have two answers to it. One first, it's a little bit besides the point, and then I come to the point. The whole idea of cyclists and non-cyclists for me is also a very US or North American discussion. Like before I came here, I rode my bike for some trips in Europe. I rode transit, I drove for some trips, and I walked for some trips. I never have said that I'm a cyclist. No, I ride my bike to work and people refer to me as a cyclist or an avid cyclist. I don't think I'm a cyclist. I'm using a bike for certain trips because it makes sense to use the bike for these trips. And for other trips, I may drive or I ride public transport. But so this dichotomy between cyclist and driver is a very strange thing to me. That's just as a side note. There is conflict between pedestrians and cyclists in shared facilities, because if cyclists are not watching out for pedestrians, and I think they do because they should, because they are the stronger mode and the faster mode, they can be a danger to pedestrians. They can run over pedestrians. And so some of these bike expressways we saw where they try to separate them are sort of a good idea. I think they're in the same boat politically, and together with public transport, actually, because I think that together with public transport, walking and cycling can form an alternative to the car. So some trips that you would make by car, you can make by public transport, especially to commute to work, going fast to the inner city in the morning. Other trips in the neighborhood that are a little bit farther away, you may be able to make by bike. And yet other trips that are really close, you can make on foot. And so together these modes, in Europe, they often call them the green modes, they can replace the automobile. And so politically, I think they're in the same boat, but there can be conflicts on specific facilities, especially if cyclists do not watch out for pedestrians.
Well, I have a comment about these conflicts even between fast and slow cyclists and with pedestrians, because we have over 150 miles of superb greenways here in the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill area. And I see these conflicts all the time. And so often the pedestrians don't just stay to the right, or they can't even hear when I ring the bell or I say to your left, because they've got their earbuds, or you call those things, and they're listening to music. They're in another world. So, I mean, pedestrians can be at fault, but and then cyclists, I mean, often don't ring their bell. They don't say to your left, and it really sort of is a shocker to pedestrians when they whiz by. But I even I'm a slow cyclist, so I'm going 10, 12 miles an hour. I hope that doesn't disgust some of you who go 20. I'm more scared actually by the fast cyclists, and I have more conflicts with them than with the pedestrians, because they're going, it's like 20 miles an hour. Sometimes they're riding almost like pellet, 3, 4, 5 in a row right next to each other. And I mean, that's fast and it's dangerous. And these are multi-use paths or shared use paths. And I don't think people should be allowed. I think there's a speed limit here in Raleigh of 10 miles an hour on the Greenways, but the fast cyclists ignore it. They're going 25 miles. So the point is that on the one hand, pedestrians aren't always behaving in the right way to share the space. Cyclists aren't always behaving in the right way. And it's like, it's a mutual problem, and it's both the fault of the pedestrians and the cyclists, and even within the cyclists, fast cyclists and slower cyclists. It's a real problem with shared space, and there's really no alternative to a shared space. You're not going to get 150 miles of exclusive bikeways here in the Raleigh area, but you have by the way, these greenways have regularly been rated as the #1 most popular government expenditure of any kind, year after year after year here in the Triangle area.
Peter, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yeah, okay,
Hey.
okay, great. If I may, Eldon Bays with the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee in Alexandria, Virginia. Thank you very much for this presentation, and even more importantly, thank you for writing that book. It sounds like it's full of referenceable material that I'll probably be using a lot. I have the perception that getting started towards building out a multi-use, low-stress, integrated network is very, very difficult. I mean, you talk about we need an integrated strategy, a package of programs and policies, and no politician or city manager or city employee seems to want to hear that as the starting point. What is the starting point for getting a city to begin to move towards something like Seville did or something like Portland did? How do you start? How do you get your nose under the tent?
They all have slightly different stories. Maybe I'll have three, and if they fit for Alexandria, we can maybe discuss at another time, because I'm also in Alexandria. So the first is in Seville, it was a top-down decision. It was the political party coming in, running on the platform to traffic calm or pedestrianize the downtown area and build a bikeway network to get there. So that was sort of the top-down approach. In Portland, what really helped them was funding that was dedicated from the state. I think going back all the way to the 70s, they had a share of their transport budget that was dedicated towards bicycling expenditures. And so that's what they could use to build bike networks, sort of also a help from the outside. The most recent city I'm looking at is Frankfurt in Germany, who promoted bicycling from 5% to now 20%. And they advise not to have a big plan. They tried that in the 90s and it failed because it took too much time to plan it. It was too expensive and people were against it. They tried again starting in the 2000s, and their approach then was within the city administration that the bike planners and the transport planners sort of tried to make bicycling a consideration in every project that is built. So trying to win over the engineers in the city, the planners of the city, when they resurface a roadway, when they redesign an intersection, when they, whatever they do, to always consider bicycling. And then, that's what they tell us, bit by bit, they were able to make the city more bike friendly. It increased the bikeway network, it changed the intersections, it increased bike parking, etc. And over time then, more and more people were in city administration, were exposed to bicycling, they were thinking about bicycling, bicycling got more attractive for the population to ride, and over time public support also grew for it. And at the moment, they just a year ago they had a big referendum in the city that sort of decided that Frankfurt wants to become a bicycle city, whatever that means. But the point is, they started out not with a big plan. They started out with integrating bicycling in everyday activities of the city and every day of planning, and sort of pushed it by bit by bit.
Okay. I'd like to just say one thing. I think we don't really know how much funding will be available for bicycling from this new mega infrastructure program. But I mean, if something like almost $2 trillion, I think overall, and if even we had $1 or $2 billion, that would hold a lot of protected bikeways. That is, if there were generous funding from the federal government for, I mean, not even just bicycling infrastructure programs, what these complementary policies, that would be really a nice sort of stimulus for bicycling in American cities, I think.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to John and Ralph. I would like to acknowledge that you're not required to hang out here all night with these folks. Hang out as long as you'd like to. Remember, this is like happy hour, and we'll keep the room open. I'll hang out till 7. I like the way Eldon just did it. by unmuting and speaking. I think we can do that. We're a room full of friends. This is mingling at the end of the event. But before we switch over, I would just like to simply, again, thank you guys. And remember that also PC is a nonprofit organization, and we depend on contributions from members and people like you to support our work. Go to our website to learn how to do that. Thank you. And
may I make just one comment?
please,
Since you're saying this bicycling happy hour, it means folks can start drinking. And more than just water.
I have two more. Yeah. I have two more thoughts on the last question.
Yeah.
So looking at some of the European cities, when they started promoting cycling and walking, it was related to safety. In the 70s, the high fatality rates for cyclists and pedestrians, especially of children, and John talked to that a little bit in the presentation, got many people united to increase the safety of walking and of cycling in the city and giving back some of the space that was given to the car. So safety was a big element in promoting that, especially children's safety. And the second is right behind me. We see King Street in Old Town. So I think we have a good moment now where many people have tried bicycling again who haven't ridden for a while, and we have to implement bike-friendly policies to keep people on bikes and encourage them to ride again. And it has already gotten much harder. So during the lockdown, there was almost no traffic in Alexandria and in Old Town, and I would cycle with our two kids. They're 8 and 6, and we'd cycle 3 abreast, and there was no car traffic, and we'd go around Old Town. We go down to the waterfront and back, and we did that a lot. And now it has gotten hard. One of the younger one, the 6-year-old, says, "I don't want to ride with the cars." So he would need a space where he feels safe at, and we have to provide these spaces because people, not just the 6-year-old, but people have had good experiences riding bikes, and we have to continue facilitating that.
I have a comment that I don't think I've made yet, and that is the colleague, the public health colleague who wrote the chapter on women and cycling, Jan Gerard, told me the story of she had done I think it was a 3-week study tour of the Netherlands and Denmark. And she's in Melbourne, Australia, and believe you me, drivers in Australia are even worse than drivers in the United States. At any rate, so I asked her, I said, "Well, Jan, now, what is it that impressed you the most about cycling in the Netherlands? And how did you feel?" And she said, well, she had never in her entire life felt so unstressed out, so safe, so comfortable cycling as in the Netherlands. And now, what is it that made you feel like that? She says, well, the cycling infrastructure was fantastic. It was absolutely very well designed. It was not interrupted. It was continuous and integrated, and it was a complete network of really great cycling facilities. And she said, but what she felt was even more striking and even more important in making her feel comfortable cycling and safe is what she sensed the attitude of motorists to be. She said she could sense and feel and see. Motorists were explicitly doing what Ralph wasn't doing when he failed his test. They were really watching out for her. They were really paying attention. And she said, even in cases where technically the motorists sort of had the right of way, they would yield. And she knew she was not at the mercy of these motorists. These motorists, as you would expect, I mean, with the mode share as high as it is in the Netherlands, every single motorist is also a bicyclist. I mean, every motorist rides a bike. I mean, it's just absolutely positively. So they're not seen as different. They're one of us. And anyway, she said, I thought that was really, really interesting to me. I would have thought, oh, obviously it was the great cycling infrastructure. So, well, that was good. But what really surprised her the most was how much it made her feel comfortable and safe, the behavior of the motorists vis-a-vis the cyclists.
I was wondering, I bike all around Charlottesville, and you all aren't here in Charlottesville and you don't know that it's challenging, not just because of the traffic, but because of the hills. Charlottesville's very hilly. And so I feel like in a place like Charlottesville, e-bikes are really going to be necessary to get much of the population out of cars and into alternative vehicles and scooters and so on. And I missed the beginning of your talk. I don't know if you cover e-bikes, or what there are issues with differing speeds that'll come up with people on on non-e-bikes and on e-bikes, and what you see as the future of e-bikes in general.
Ralph, I'm going to let you answer this because you have an e-bike, and I thought it was really interesting the experience that you've had with e-bikes.
Yeah, so a couple of things with e-bikes. So we have a full chapter on e-bikes, looking at the spread in Europe and North America. They're much more widely used in Europe, mainly these pedelecs, where you get pedal assist only when you actually electric assist when you only pedal. In the beginning, they were mainly bought by people interested in technology or older individuals, especially in the Netherlands. And now they have sort of moved more into the general public, and more people are buying them. There are several classes of them. So there are some that only go 20 miles per hour. There are some that go 28 miles per hour. And then there is another class that has a throttle. So you don't have to pedal. As just from my own experience, hills are a very big issue, and the e-bike has made it really easy to go over these hills. It's less effort to go over the hills, and because I use it to go to work, you arrive less sweaty. It's not necessarily that much faster time-wise. Like I only save maybe 10 minutes out of a 40-minute commute. It's not huge, but the arriving there is very different, and it allows me to ride with motor vehicle traffic more than it allowed me before, because I'm faster, and I can sort of almost take a lane. I feel much more stable and comfortable riding with faster moving cars than before. I'm a little afraid of riding on trails because of the speed, not because of the speed, because of my attentiveness to watching out for pedestrians and other cyclists. So with the e-bike, I have also another bike. With the e-bike, I try to stay off the trails because I just don't feel comfortable there. I ride on trails in the winter because there are not many other people on the trails with the e-bike, but I stay away from it. But there was a very good point made by Robin Stallings, who is a bike advocate in Texas, and we had this discussion around e-bikes and around speed differentials and danger. And Robin said he's not for regulating e-bikes. He says e-bikes have to obey the rules of the road and the rules of the trail. So you have to enforce it, but you shouldn't ban e-bikes from the trails. And his example was, you also allow a Porsche to drive in a neighborhood street, even it can go 150 miles per hour. You're not banning the Porsche from the neighborhood street because it could go a higher maximum speed. You're regulating the Porsche to drive the speed of that neighborhood. And it was the first time I had heard that argument, but I found it sort of plausible. But it requires that the cyclists obey the speed law. On a last note, and then I can pass it to John. Many of the e-bikes I see on the trails around here are older individuals who are not riding all that fast. They're having some electric support, but they are not going 20 miles, 28 miles per hour. They would probably be individuals who would not ride at all if the electric assist wouldn't be there. But it's just sort of my own perception.
That's exactly my experience. And I mean, I'm on these trails, these greenways, almost every day. And I can confirm exactly what Ralph said. First of all, I can recognize more and more e-bikes I see on the trails. And they are primarily ridden by older adults, and they are not nearly as fast as the racing cyclists who seem to be training for the Tour de France. They're not supposed to do it, but they do. But they're not going that much faster than I am, and I'm only going about 12 miles an hour. Maybe they're going 15 miles an hour or something like that, but they're certainly not speeding along the greenways. I haven't seen one single e-bike, and I can recognize what it is, that's really going that fast. So at least on Greenways, maybe we older adults just respect other people more, and so we don't go 50 miles an hour on the Greenway. But to my surprise, I mean, my own fear was, oh, with these e-bikes, they're going to be dangerous on the trails. But that's not what I've experienced.
Doesn't it just seem that the main concept for riding on trails is that people must be paying attention and looking, and that's the same rule as always. But for some reason, when people are driving an automobile, they're inside an enclosed space, and it's easier to be a little bit careless with paying attention. And somehow, if you're there with other people sharing the air, and especially if it's a pleasant green place, it's just a little easier to think of others.
It's not as anonymous. You know, it's like when you're in a car. I mean, I have seen dueling cars talking about the problems of anonymity, where motorists are driving, I mean, really homicidally, I would say. And it's like, because they don't really see the motorist in the other car as a person. It's like this anonymity. They don't really, there's no human connection. Whereas on a trail, you're right there. The pedestrian is next to you. The other cyclists are next to you. There's a much closer personal feeling and relationship, which I think encourages more sharing, a more civilized sharing of a common space.
My computer's really low on the battery, and I'm way out where I don't have a place to plug it in, but I'd like to share something. I don't know if you can see me for some reason. Can you see me?
Yeah.
I'm working on an art project. It's actually a quilt. And so most of the squares are just normal pieces like this. But I'm going to show you, this is a square I made that has a bicycle on it. Here. Ta-da. Wrong one. This one.
Ah.
Cute.
Very good.
The red stripe is for the flag of a country where I have enjoyed going before, Belarus.
Aha. Thanks for sharing that with us.
I learned to bike in Potsdam, Germany, in Berlin and in Potsdam, where it was very easy to get onto a train with a bicycle and then continue your trip.
I've done exactly that. I took the S-Bahn from downtown Berlin out to, well, I can't remember the direction I took it in, but it was a colleague of mine at the German Economic Institute. And then we biked in one direction and the train back. And it was very, actually in Germany, throughout Europe, they really have a very nice arrangement where you can take a long bike trip and then you take the S-Bahn back, and or whatever the suburban rail is called there. And Ralph lived in Berlin for a year, I think. And so he knows all about, and Berlin, by the way, they doubled or tripled the amount of bicycling in Berlin. Ralph, do you know anything about exactly what they did to do that?
I mean, Berlin put in separate bikeway infrastructure. They traffic calmed a whole big part of the city. And Berlin is an easy city to cycle because it's a large city, but it has a very strong neighborhood structure. So many people work or shop or do other things within a neighborhood. So they call it Kiez, and they have these sort of centers within. So not everybody has to go into the downtown, but it still needed promotion through bikeways and traffic calming, etc.
Ralph, would you do me a favor and tell the story of Paris? The difference, the transformation of Paris from where you once lived there and it was impossible to bicycle. Tell that story. That was, I found, really impressive.
I mean, so I lived in Paris around the year 2000, something like that. And it was a horrible place to ride a bike. It's a beautiful city, but the streets were full of cars. They were speeding. They were honking. There were almost fights among drivers in the narrow streets there of Paris. And in fact, when I lived there, I had a friend from Germany come visit me who brought the bicycle on the train. I wanted to ride his bike. And I still remember him attempting to ride his bike in Paris and go around the Arc de Triomphe on a bike. And I was so scared for him at the time. But now if you go back, Paris has really made a big effort to take away space from automobiles and give it to bicycles, sometimes shared with buses, and has really impressive growth in cycling and has been transformed towards a more bike-friendly city.
I think it's a very hopeful message. I mean, the cities such as New York and London and Paris, which were not at all bike friendly. I mean, New York for cyclists, it was like, forget it. That was even worse than Paris. And now all of a sudden, it's I think they now have almost 200 miles of physically separated, protected bike lanes, bikeways, and it just would have been inconceivable 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so I mean, things can really be changed for the better. And with groups like Peter's group and other environmental and sustainability promoting groups, I mean, these things are possible. But your input is crucial, by the way. I mean, like I said before, the advocacy, this is why we have that whole chapter on advocacy, because it's just so crucial. It's one of the crucial ways of getting the right things implemented. And it's not going to happen by itself.